Welcome everyone to the final event in this season of Meet KU's Authors, a speaker series co-hosted by the Hall Center for the Humanities and Lawrence Public Library. My name is Richard Godbeer, and I have the great honor to serve as director of the Hall Center, where we believe that the humanities must play a critical role in building a humane future for our world. Whether this is the first event that you've attended at the Hall Center or the latest of many, I'm delighted that you're here, and I hope that you'll return over and over again. The Hall Center is very pleased to be partnering with the Lawrence Public Library in co-hosting this series, which features KU faculty talking informally about their recently published books, taking us behind the curtain to explain why they embarked on these projects, what they found, and why their projects matter. This event is also co-sponsored by Kansas Public Radio, to whom many thanks. Because of the physical distancing made necessary by the pandemic, all of our public programs this spring have taken place online. We look forward to resuming in-person gatherings once it's safe to do so, hopefully this fall. If you'd like to read about our upcoming events, please visit our website at hallcenter.ku.edu. And for the Lawrence Public Library, lplks.org. As we adapt to this unprecedented situation and face cuts in funding, we need your help more than ever. We hope that you'll consider becoming a friend of the Hall Center or renewing your membership, if possible, with an increased gift. Many thanks to those of you who have already done so. Your generosity helps us to support outstanding scholarship and to share with audiences across and far beyond Lawrence the excitement of the humanities and their relevance to our contemporary world. This evening, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague and good friend, Professor Marni Kessler. Professor Kessler received her undergraduate degree from Vassar College, an MA from Williams College, and her PhD from Yale University. She has taught in the Kress Foundation Department of Art History here at KU since the turn of the millennium in 2000. Dr. Kessler specializes in 19th century French art. Her research is characterized by close visual analysis, careful attention to historical context, and engagement with critical theories in materiality, psychoanalysis, and phenomenology. Her first book, Sheer Presence, The Veil in Manet's Paris, examines representations of the veil in late 19th century French painting, photography, and popular imagery. Dr. Kessler has also published articles and book chapters on topics related to fashion, food, photography, gender, urbanism, and portraiture in late 19th century French visual culture. Tonight, she's going to talk about her latest book, Discomfort Food, the Culinary in Late 19th Century French Art. Here in the early 21st century, chefs have become international celebrities, some of them celebrated as much for their sex appeal as for their culinary skills. While beautifully illustrated cookbooks, food blogs, and Instagram posts make our mouths salivate. In her new book, Dr. Kessler takes us back in time and trains her eye on vivid depictions of food in 19th century French art. Dr. Kessler argues, as you're about to hear, that beneath the surface abundance in works by Manet, Degas, and others lie strains of anxiety, nostalgia, and melancholy. She shows how images of food presented a spectrum from pleasure to unease associated with modern life. Discomfort Food reveals the very personal, often deeply uncomfortable feelings lurking within the relationships that develop between ourselves and representations of what we eat. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marni Kessler.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that lovely introduction and for this invitation to participate in this series. I also want to say or express my gratitude to the Hall Center for funding that was absolutely critical in the writing and the publication of this book. I had a residential fellowship several years ago that really enabled me to make incredible progress on the book, and I received a subvention grant that helped to support the production of the book. So the Hall Center has my deepest gratitude, as do all of you. Thank you for joining me this evening. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity this evening to talk to you about Discomfort Food, the Culinary Imagination in late 19th century French art. In many respects, this is as much an academic book as it is a deeply personal one. And I hope in the next half hour or so to give you a taste, I'm sorry, the puns are endless, a taste of it by describing the larger contours of the arguments that animate it, and by telling you a bit about how I came to the topic, what inspired me as I wrote, and what I discovered about myself in the process. Although I didn't know it at the time, the ideas that form the foundation of this book first came to me during a visit to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in 2005. When I saw Antoine Vollon's Mound of Butter in the no longer extant small French paintings gallery that was just inside the West entrance, I was stopped in my tracks, and I knew that I had to find a way to write about it. I was certainly swept in by the subject, who doesn't love butter? But I was dazzled by the sumptuous licks of paint, luxurious strokes of cadmium yellow, combining to deliver the very essence of butter. Thick and rich pigment whipped into a luminous mound. The light that winks across it is our light too. We can even picture the artist's hand moving around the canvas, the action of smearing his brush and palette knife through cushions of densely layered matière, carrying for him the familiar echo of the simple act of smoothing tempered butter upon a slice of freshly baked bread. But even as I reveled in this painting's radiant facticity, I also sensed the stir of something else, something disquieting, hovering at the fringes of my experience of it. And this tension between pure, unalloyed delight and its antithesis further intrigued me. For the very downy peaks that captured my attention, I gradually came to see, are met with oily plains and flashes of white, tan, and paler yellow that disclose the unpleasant possibility that Vollon gives to us butter that is in the process of melting and spoiling, the milk product's inherent instability, the artist's forthright representation of it, intertwined with my own knowledge of what happens to exposed butter, a screen through which I took in the painting. The cascade of cheesecloth circling its base, which Vollon rendered as if it were both the most delicate meringue and a storm-tossed sea, sharpens that sense of volatility. And the disproportionately small eggs that sit precariously at the edge of the table amplify not just that instability, but also the sheer magnitude of the mound. All of this generated a disequilibrium that seemed to me in conflict with the subject. But perhaps even more astonishingly, I also detected within Vollon's scrambled eddies of paint the form of a head, entirely incongruous, of course, but assuredly there, so much so that I couldn't find a way to unsee it. It was this painting, which we then thought was by Géricault and depicted a severed head, that swam into my mind as I stood before Mound of Butter. The head that I perceived crudely described and in near profile in Vollon's tantalizing depiction of butter infused it with an unexpected unseemliness. At the time, though, I didn't know just how unseemly this magisterial heap could be, a point to which I will return. I was working on a book about Edgar Degas' depiction of family in New Orleans in 2005. So I tucked this painting and all that it conjured for me into a file in the back of my mind. A few years later, I saw a call for papers for a conference panel titled Food into Art, and I decided to resurrect, so to speak, the severed head butter painting. I gave that paper, which led to another one, and in 2008, to the opportunity to expand it into an article. To do that, I temporarily put aside Degas' family portraits, and I re-immersed myself with so much joy into research on butter in late 19th century France. Only gradually and over several more years did I accept that it was okay to turn the work for what I had envisioned as a book titled Degas' Family Album into 2 long articles, and that I could instead write this book, the one I desperately wanted to write about late 19th century French depictions of food, in which Vollon's astonishing painting of butter would prominently feature. These are the rough contours of the story of how I came to this project, how a happenstance encounter became a formative one, and how Vollon's butter led me to write a book that would move in directions I could never have imagined, some of them scholarly, and some of them, as you will see, personal. The larger premise of Discomfort Food is this: representations of food are profoundly evocative, able to convey material and immaterial possibilities that may appear to be inconsistent with their seemingly mundane subject matter. Depictions of the elementary, I argue, resonate far beyond the physical bounds of the picture plane, tying us to both the sensory present and the fullness of the past, to our memories, our families, our traditions, our happinesses, and our losses. And these pictures are, of course, fixed too to the artists who created them, to sentient beings who lived and ate, who loved and experienced sadness. At the center of my study are these works by Edouard Manet, Antoine Vollon, Gustave Caillebotte, and Edgar Degas, all of which superficially conjure narratives of gustatory pleasures. But as I show, they each also engage more nuanced and even unsettling associations. These depictions of fish, fruit, butter, and meat, things so apparently anodyne, are, in my analysis, haunted by anxiety, nostalgia, and melancholy for and about family, home, and the past. Rooted in history, these images immerse us in the present, in the smell and taste and feel of what we see depicted, sometimes pale versions of the real thing, and sometimes so vivid that they catch our breath. Our visceral responses to these pictures matter to our understanding of them, and mine are intertwined with my academic exploration of them and their historical contexts. This is what helped me to construe the work's capaciousness and contradictory effects. I was drawn into each of them, even as I recognized, perhaps because I recognized, their inherent tensions. These pictures of things that we associate with a range of culinary pleasures, each in their own unique ways, demonstrating too their own inherent displeasures. These works spool across a period of great social, cultural, and political turmoil. The expansion of industry and the protracted instability associated with the renovations of Paris under Napoleon III and the Baron Haussmann coincided with the traumatic experience and aftermath of war and war-induced food shortages, the latter caricatured here in an album created during the 1870-71 siege of Paris by Prussian forces. On the frontispiece on the left, Paris is personified as a vicious-looking consumer of mice. A cat and a dog spill out of cooking vessels. A chef wielding a saber leads a horse toward its obvious fate. A butcher shop line erupts in chaos. And at the bottom, hay is used to create blackened loaves. In the illustration on the right, starving animals from the zoo at their Jardin des Plantes, many of which were themselves ultimately eaten by desperate Parisians, are depicted queuing at a butcher shop, like everyone else, to try to get a ration of meat. The siege lasted for 4 months and the shortages even longer, but the memories haunted those who survived. Added to this, decades of rampant food adulteration reached a fevered pitch in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, forcing a public hygiene movement to bring new regulations to things like butchery practices and the production and preservation of milk products. To be sure, throughout the second half of the 19th century, edible things, whether real or represented, were freighted, sources of both comfort and discomfort. And depictions of food made during these troubling times precisely because of what they picture, could effectively function for contemporaries as their inverse, as sites for the negotiation of disquiet and discomfort. Inherently connected to daily life and identity, to family, home, and memory, food came to function materially and metaphorically for certain artists as potent vehicles for evoking a spectrum of pleasure and uneasiness associated with public and private life in late 19th century Paris. In considering these more subjective nuances, as well as the production, processing, handling, and consumption of food itself at the time, and how these realities might be articulated in works of art, I shift away from prevailing tendencies to categorize these images as still lives and toward more analytic scrutiny of them as representations of food containing tangible critical capacities and expressive force. To put it another way, with this project, I seek to augment our study of depictions of edible things by demonstrating that they demand to be treated as such, and that certain linear models and classifications fail to do justice to the ways in which they are singularly suggestive and engender distinctly visceral reactions of the sort that we may not have in relation to a painting of, say, flowers or insects or books or shells. Depictions of food I show are deeply complex and individual. They inevitably summon not just some of the more fugitive aspects of everyday life, but also the intricate webs that constitute our memories and the myriad pleasures and discomforts that may accompany our thoughts of them. They are always richly evocative, capable of conveying delight and the promise of culinary satisfaction, even as they sublimate their corollary. By introducing the transgressive power of food into analysis of representations of it, I thus expose the messier aspects of images that take as their subject something so fundamental to all human experience. Each chapter of the book focuses on one or two works and engages my larger claim about how such ostensibly straightforward pictures can be dense with unanticipated significance. Edouard Manet's Fish Still Life, which forms the core of the first chapter, may appear to depict the ingredients for a humble stew and a vessel in which to cook it. But wafting around this fragile veneer of contentment that an imagined bowl of fish stew would proffer is a surprising unsettledness. The mouth of the bloated gray mullet at the center of the composition is poignantly ajar, and its frayed tail is suspended, as if fixed in that moment when it pointlessly thrashed about to free itself from its captor. Errant smears of blood read like fingerprints upon the worn-away iridescence of the mullet's skin, so near to where its lifeless heart would be. A heap of oysters seems to quiver at the left, their liquor blooming unchecked across the cloth beneath them. A monstrous-looking red gurnard seems poised to attack, its bristly fins suggesting that it could still cut seamlessly through the dark reaches of the ocean, its one stunned, bulging eye unnerving. And an eel is troublingly animated as it appears to slither across the filthy tablecloth, a piece of which is tucked beneath its tail. Even the lemon, its rind an impastoed whip of sun-warmed yellow, it looks as if it's been turning on its axis. And the copper pot is strangely anthropomorphized, its lid widened to circumscribe an unfilled space, not unlike a human mouth as it opens to speak or receive food, or a mullet's as it frantically tries to survive. These lifeless sea creatures all seem to be in the process of struggling to survive. Each is thick with anxiety, haunted by a grief we will never know. By imagining the scene in the way that he does, Manet, I argue, invokes the dark realities of these piscine beings, the mingled smells of rotting fish and brine that emanate somehow from oil pigment laid on canvas, underscoring his point. Instead of the ingredients for a bouillabaisse, which is what I assumed the picture contained when I first began my research on it, Manet conjures putrefaction and death, bringing us, as I contend, to both the fictional corpses described in contemporary crime novels and to the real ones on display in the New Paris morgue that opened in 1864. Here, pathetic bloated bodies fished out of the Seine or found murdered on the streets would lie on tilted marble slabs to be gawked at from the other side of a window by the thousands of curious Parisians who came to see them each day. Antoine Vollon's magisterial Mound of Butter seems the very epitome of richness and comfort. As I began to describe, I was initially enthralled by its creamy buttercup yellow strokes that churn and whir and are marshaled to constitute the very texture of butter. But what at first seemed so alluring, capturing thoughts of lavish meals and complex sauces, flaky pastries and sugary confections, transmuted into the more disconcerting perception that this heap of butter is on the cusp of both spoiling and melting, its battered and liquescent surface betraying its vulnerability. As I explain in chapter 2, it is just this, the real product's inherent ephemerality, that led Vollon to turn to it for this painting and to model it into a cipher for expressing contemporary anxieties about butter's safe preservation and its pervasive adulteration. Indeed, as I discovered, much to my surprise, at the time, products like talc, beef tallow, calf brains, lead carbonate, wheat flour, and potato starch, to name but a few, were commonly added to butter to increase its weight and thus its price, and fresh butter was often surreptitiously molded around a rancid heap, portions of which would be sold to unknowing customers. Butter's position in the late 19th century culinary imagination would have been fraught, to say the least, its possible hazards as great as its envisioned pleasures. This ingredient, essential to so many dishes and a staple in every household, was unreliable, could be poisonous and or rancid, and had to be fiercely guarded. And it is this milk product's intrinsic plasticity, both its potential for being adulterated and spoiled and its malleable physical properties, that enabled Vollon to use it, to evoke things unrelated to it. Indeed, a depiction of a mass of butter that resembles a head detached from a body and has a blunt object sunk into it could also manifest another weighty social concern of the time, France's traumatic memory of the guillotine of the 1789 revolution and the vehement debate about its continued use for public beheadings throughout the 19th century, the latter redoubled by the circulation of prints like this one. Ostensibly the most ordinary of things, this heap of butter wavers at the fine edge between being a representation of the milk product itself and all that its adulterated status at the time engenders, and being a teasing suggestion of other things, like an archaeological site, an object retrieved from one, and perhaps most unnervingly, a severed head. The first two chapters consider the individual elements that constitute the works that are their chief concerns. Chapter 3 understands a painting's components as constitutive of a larger architected whole. In Fruit Displayed on a Stand, Gustave Caillebotte presents a greengrocer's artful arrangement of the bounty of a late summer, early fall harvest. But in my analysis, the canvas also materializes as something quite apart from what it represents. Crumpled sheets of packing paper disaggregate clusters of brilliantly colored fruits. The composition we come to see formally echoes the radiating grid of Paris as it emerged during Haussmann's renovations, summoning the multicolored maps that themselves constructed an orderly version of the swiftly changing urban fabric. For these segments of fruit scan like the cartographer's pink, green, blue, and yellow arrondissements, each one ribboned with boulevards and veined by streets. So too do we see the possibility that the artist, always interested in the newest advancements, filtered his view through the one that was taking Paris by storm, the photographer Nadal's aerial views of the city from his hot air balloon, like this one of the Place de l'Étoile and its surrounding boulevards, streets, and green spaces. The painting's structural logic thus situates us both near and far, within a fruit seller's shop, on the streets, in the sky, on the map. So while it certainly celebrates the dazzle of a greengrocer's staging of produce, fruit displayed on a stand I show is rooted too in the same attraction to the city's dramatic perspectives and new technologies that inspired some of Caillebott's more distinctly urban works, like his Grand Paris Street Rainy Day and Le Pont de l'Europe. We might, in fact, be tempted not to see that a view of fruits and not boulevards or buildings or a bridge could assume the look of the new metropolis, ordered, controlled, gridded, and multiplied. However, I propose that Caillebott discovers in even this unlikely subject a distinctly urban format. And yet, even as this close-up view organizes peaches and oranges and figs and plums and apples and pears and quinces and tomatoes into a grid that celebrates the metropolis, the canvas, I argue, also mourns the rural gardens and plots of farmland in which the fruits were grown, and the parts of the old city that were lost when meandering streets and historic buildings were demolished to make way for the clean lines of boulevards with uniform buildings that we associate with the city today. For subtle disturbances subvert the painting's prevailing impression of order. Piles that could easily topple, surfaces of fruit stippled by time and wear. We know the future of these perishable things, their destinies to be consumed or to rot, a gentle murmur that fractures the picture's fragile veneer of equilibrium and control. Nothing can stay as it is. Unlike the other artists upon whom I focus in this book, Edgar Degas rarely included food in his work. But in two quite disparate images, we find, of all things, prominent pieces of vividly rendered meat. In his 1866 painting, a jarringly corporeal and bloody pig's trotter and a cut boudin sausage are nestled together on a platter that lies on a cloth-covered table, and a wooden pallet holding a raw rib roast is set quite shockingly on the floor. Between these hunks of animal flesh, an anonymous man sits on an upholstered chair that is itself the color of cooked meat. I first noticed Portrait of a Man about 15 years ago at the Brooklyn Museum. It was a revelation to me, so like and unlike every other work by Degas that I knew. Images of contemporary figures and interiors abound in his expansive oeuvre. But what stunned me were the masses of meat that resembled nothing I'd ever before or have since seen in any of his work. Boldly realized, these pieces of meat render our encounter with the painting strikingly visceral. Our own memories of eating, touching, and smelling meat, inflecting our visual experiences of this curious picture in which a slab of meat lies on the floor and a gruesome bleeding pig's trotter eerily assumes the position it would have held when attached to the animal in which it originated. And the simultaneously phallic and scatological sausage against which the trotter is suggestively nuzzled redoubles these troubling corporeal connections. All of this propelled my research, leading me to a dark reality about insalubrious animal slaughtering practices and concerns about public health. I discovered that contemporary debates about animal butchery and sanitation led to the opening in 1867, just a year after Degas created this painting, of La Villette, the centralized slaughterhouse on the northeastern edge of Paris. One of the purposes of La Villette was to ensure that the violence and messiness and the resulting stenches and miasmas of animal death be made invisible to the public, allowing only bled and cleaned cuts of meat to leave the facility. I have to apologize to those of you who might be eating dinner. I hope that this isn't ruining your meal. If anything, it's making it, you're having the sense of the discomfort inherent in food. But despite the controversies about animal slaughter, about which Degas would have been well aware, his trotter brazenly advertises the lurid proof that it has been freshly carved from the pig. Framing Degas' blunt and disquieting depiction of raw beef and pork product within this historical context expanded my analysis of the painting in surprising ways and led me to see, too, that this early canvas that so powerfully incorporates meat may be read as a kind of preview of his much later inclusion of his friend Edouard Manet's 1875 oil painting, Ham, in a photograph from 1895. Nearly 30 years elapsed before Degas would revisit the evocative capacities of animal flesh, this time in the reproducible medium of silver gelatin print. 3 objects, 2 of which are by Manet, adorn the wall behind Degas, who sits at his desk in the background. Above him hangs a fragment of a portrait that he painted of Manet and his wife Suzanne, the front part of the latter sliced off by Manet himself as if it were a slice of grisly meat. Infuriated, Degas took the ruined canvas back, and nearly 30 years later chose to highlight it in his artful wall arrangement and to photograph it, the resulting silver gelatin print comprised of wafer-thin coatings of a substance that is derived from animal collagen, itself a spectral medium haunted by the living flesh and bones rendered to produce it. Like the masses of meat in the 1866 painting, Manet's representation of a cooked ham, which Degas ensured would be showered in a beam of lamplight, amplifies the suggestive possibilities of the photograph. In my analysis, we come to see that his wedge of cured porcine haunch materially and conceptually restores the lost parts of a human body. These eloquent hunks of meat that are central to both compositions thus far exceed their purely culinary value, invoking not just complicated issues related to animal butchery, but as I also explore contemporary anatomical drawings of cross-section views of the interior of the human body, of the sort that that artists studied in their anatomy classes at the École des Beaux-Arts. The fish, butter, fruits, and meats depicted by Manet, Vollon, Degas, and Caillebotte hold unexpected possibility. I offer in Discomfort Food readings that are formed by close looking, deep archival research and engagement with the secondary literature. If the methods and theories of academic practice establish the armature of this study, my own history lies at the book's beating heart. I didn't know this when I started out, but during the years in which I worked on this project, I came to understand something more of why these pictures mattered so much to me. Why, for example, the mullet at the center of Manet's painting seemed so melancholy to me, and how my response to it was inflected by memories of a photograph of my grandfather proudly holding a fish the size of his torso that sat in a silver frame on my grandmother's dresser for as long as I can remember. And why Manet's eel disturbed me enough to say to a friend that I didn't think that I could stand to work on this picture. That slimy eel I discovered over time reminded me of fishing as a girl with my grandfather, father, uncle, and cousin, and finding it impossible to bait my own hook because the writhing worms were too upsetting to me. But that unbearably beautiful lemon and those clattery oysters lured me back to the painting, unfurling memories of my mother making stuffed clams in our kitchen in Brooklyn. And something of that wedge of raw meat on the ground beside the sorrowful man in Degas' painting led me, however circuitously, to my family's holiday dinner table, to the brisket that we have eaten for generations, simmered for hours in that particular heady fusion of onions and garlic and cranberries and raspberry preserves. Such memories drove me, whether I realized it or not, to search for these images' most expansive resonances and material depths. braiding these strands of personal experience and scholarly analysis, melding them as one would the ingredients in a recipe, I hope my book demonstrates, enriches, and makes more complex the quality of the proverbial final dish. To be sure, images of food, like their analogs in our world, touch us deeply. They are decidedly evocative and always personal for the artist then, as for the viewer now. Their sensory and conceptual dimensions seemingly endless in ways both concrete and ineffable. Many factors, some conscious, some not, brought me to this tablescape of struggling fish, this striking mound of butter, this vibrant arrangement of fruit, this mournful man surrounded by cuts of meat, this photograph that features a painting of a plump ham, though others would surely have provided equally rich ground for analysis. But something of these works, independently and collectively, made sense to me as the foundation for this book that explores the deep redolence and profound poignance of representations of food, how they may evoke the promise and memory of great pleasure and comfort, even as they embody and spark countervailing arcs of discomfort. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marni. That was just fascinating. So vivid and original and thought-provoking. We already have some questions here, so let's get going. The first asks you to talk more about the ways in which you balance in this project the deeply personal with more sort of conventionally academic analysis, which, you know, even though things have changed a little bit over the last decade or so, that still would strike many academics as being a risk. So this questioner would love to hear more about your experience in welding the personal and the analytical, and how academic writing can move between these two domains.
I appreciate that question so much, because I recognize that it was a risk. And it's a risk that I could take now in my career. I could not have taken this risk as a young assistant professor. And that, I think, is an important point to make. As much as I wish we all could, have these subjective encounters, I think one needs the experience that one gets over the course of, 20 years of a career or more, really. And the balance is a delicate one. I revealed to you this evening some of the personal aspects of the book, though there are many more, because I felt that it was important to highlight that aspect of the book. I knew these pictures drew me, and they drew me in part because of their physical brilliance, and the paintings themselves are so spectacular. I'm drawn to them for all of those reasons as an art historian, but as a human being, something brought me back to them again and again in ways that felt very personal. And I came to realize that there were very deep reasons why that mullet, which I do believe looks melancholy, but I recognize the melancholy of the mullet in part because it was melancholy to me, because it reminded me, of this photograph that I'm very grateful to my uncle in Brooklyn, who is here somewhere in cyberspace, who scanned that picture for me and sent it to me. And now I get to have it too, but that photograph sat on my grandmother's dresser for as long as I knew her. And I knew there was something about that mullet that took me to that photograph. And at the same time, when I revealed to a friend that, that eel just so disgusted me, and I didn't think I could bear to even think about this painting, or let alone look closely at it, the friend said, you have to confront the eel. And I'm so grateful that she did, because in really revisiting this picture, I did kind of understand something of what was so disturbing to me about the eel. Eels are disturbing to many. I'm not the only person who might feel that, but I so vividly recall that physical, tactile, visceral sense of that slithery creature that I simply couldn't touch as a child. And, in a way, one might argue that revisiting the eel or confronting the eel allows me to kind of confront that past failure, if you can call it that. I was a very eager little fisher person, and I had very happy memories of fishing as a child with my family in the Catskill Mountains, which is where we spent our summers. So the personal was deeply, it drove me, and it's very much ingrained in what also leads me to care so much about the writing as well. I care deeply about writing and words, and I think that's also very personal for me. I'm someone who, my whole life has cared about poetry and literature. I was an English major in college, and I think that also is a personal aspect of the book that drove it for me. And that really underscores its basis. Sorry.
Right. No, thank you so much. So another question here. In the Degas with a hunk of meat on the floor, do you see anything in the painting that we can't make out behind the seated figure, behind the pork and the sausage?
Yes, and I do talk about that in the chapter. Obviously, I had to, really give a very minimal description of the picture. There are a bunch of things. There's the suggestion of what could be a canvas on an easel behind the figure, covered over in fabric. There's also along the table just behind the trotter and the boudin, there are what appear to be glasses or jars. They have reflective surfaces that suggest that they are containers of some sort. I should mention that the painting is most likely unfinished. And what's also interesting about it is that Degas never exhibited it, never sold it, and it remained in his possession until he died, which is really quite remarkable. And one of the reasons why I had never noticed it, or had not noticed it, until about 15 years ago at the Brooklyn Museum, which is my childhood museum. I grew up in Brooklyn. This is where I went to the museum. I was an intern there. I mean, it was a place, I know the collection, vividly, but suddenly they pulled it out of storage, and there it was. And it was a snowy day, and that seemed important too. I was in Brooklyn visiting my family, and I decided to bear the elements, and I went to the museum, and very few people were there, and I had this sense it was there for me, and I never forgot it, but I didn't realize I would have the opportunity to write about it in the way that I eventually did. And I have to say, it is a remarkable painting, and the curator of European art at the Brooklyn Museum, who was very helpful and really facilitated my research and allowed me to visit it in storage a few years ago so that I could really look closely at it, because they don't have it hanging a lot of the time. It's weird. Anyway, she told me they're going to proudly hang it in a new installation in the museum next year. And I mean, it touches me so. She said that my research will inform the wall text about it, which delights me so much. I mean, that's very meaningful, to me.
Thank you. So, as I look at that collection of images together, they seem very violent to me. And, even, not the fruit, not so obviously, but even then next to the fruit is the knife, almost like a dagger in the butter. And as I see it, my own personal response is the knife is about to go and start cutting up the fruit. And then I think about my own personal experience of meat. I grew up in small English country towns where the butchers had whole animals hanging up,
yes.
Not the kind of experience that children and young adults have today, where they grow up with food in plastic containers in supermarkets. I remember going into a butcher with my mother, and she's saying, "Oh yes, I'd like that bit up there," and then it'd be sort of hacked off. And so, that personal memory informs my sense of these images as being really very violent and visceral. And I'm wondering, I mean, you chose these among many potential images that you could have used for this book. And could you, I guess I'm asking two questions rolled into one. One is, I'd love you to talk a little bit about the process of choosing these particular images, which I assume was not tidy. I assume it was a process that happened in ways that I'd love to hear about. But I'm also curious as to whether what I'm saying about what seems to me the violence of these images has any resonance with you, or sort of figured in your experience of writing the book.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for that question. You know, interestingly, the Mound of Butter, for example, is an image that people just, it's very popular in food blogs. In the last 10 years, it has become very popular in food blogs, and people just extol its beauty. No one notices what I notice in it. And, you know, that butter knife that also sort of doubles as the artist's palette knife, and the idea of a knife, you know, a sharp surface, a guillotine, the blade of a guillotine, all these things. No one has noticed that before. I'm very glad that you see it too. You know, it really, I actually was with a friend that day at the National Gallery when I saw this painting, and I said to her, I see a head. This is horrifying. And she said, I just don't see it. And, you know, but to me, it was a very particular painting, the one that I put up in the PowerPoint, that flew into my mind. Whether Vollon knew it or not, he did know about the guillotine, its continued use. It was a really contentious issue. It was being used for public beheadings through the 19th century, and it was an issue that was debated in the press constantly. So I'm really very convinced that my reading, and it sounds like you are too, really does sort of accept and understand that there's something more to this image, that the superficial is, you know, gives way, in my analysis, also to all of this stuff that I discovered about butter's adulteration. And I truly, it was extraordinary when I found all that material. I had no idea when I went into this, but I knew something was disturbing about that image. Right. And the others, you know, also the Manet fish still life, you know, I was always disturbed by it, but I was also so completely taken in by that lemon. I thought that lemon was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen, but that eel, you know, it would disturb anybody. And of course, you know, eels, Émile Zola, who was a friend of Manet's, writes very vividly about the stalls, the fish stalls and the fruit stalls at Les Halles, the central marketplace in Paris. And he writes about baskets of eels incessantly weaving around each other. I mean, it's truly grotesque. And I think there is something of that in the way that Manet represents this eel. The fact that he allows the tablecloth to be tucked beneath its tail gives us the sense of its movement, right? So for me, that mullet, that sense of thrash, that sense of struggle was very much there, though I will admit, when I first set out to work on the painting, despite the eel, I really did think I would discover that this was a painting of ingredients for a bouillabaisse or another fish stew. And I went through countless late 19th century French recipe books and did not find a single recipe that even resembled what we see in this painting. Lemons wouldn't be in fish stews in the 19th century. These particular fish would not be put together in most fish stews. Oranges were very common ingredients of fish stews. And a bouquet garni, you know, of herbs, not a few sequins of parsley. You know, none of these things could amount to a fish stew. And so for me, I quickly saw that this was an image that really was about sort of death and putrefaction. And once I realized that the New Paris morgue opened in the very same year, and I saw how these bodies were displayed on these marble plinths with their heads tilted up, that mullet seemed so clearly to me, because that cloth that is so filthy looks like marble, of course. It has that, I mean, it's both grotesque and quite beautiful. And so these connections are so there for me. But to answer your other question, I could obviously go on, but I am, you know, aware that I've been going on in my response. But I do want to answer the part of your question about making decisions. And, as those of us who've written books or have written long projects, we know that there's that file that we create into which we put all of the stuff that doesn't ultimately make it into the final project. And I have that file. And I'm actually very excited about some of the material in it. But, these images all somehow, some things aren't even explainable, to be quite frank, but somehow I knew these are the images that went together. I did want to have a kind of chronological span. I wanted to, have a 1860s painting and then I end in the 1890s with a photograph. I wanted to span, that second half of the 19th century. And I wanted very much to think about these artists whose work I've actually really thought about a lot in other publications and throughout my career. And so, I tortured myself. I very much wanted, for example, to include a woman artist, Bette Morisot, Mary Cassatt, but, they don't tend to represent food, which is ironic. There's a little bit, there's tea, there's drink, and there are some apples, in paintings by Morisot, but that is not, interestingly, what they tended to represent. And what's ironic here is that in the late 19th century, still life was considered appropriate as a subject for women artists. And yet these two incredible vanguard women overtly resisted the very subject that was available to them and painted aspects of contemporary life, which I just love so much. And so I didn't want to kind of put them into this book, in part for that reason. So, the decisions were very conscious decisions, but also I'm sure there was a lot of unconscious in my ultimate decisions. And, at some point you see the arc of a book and you need to finish it. You want to finish it. You want it to have a life. We all know we could just go on and on and on, but I wanted to finish the book very much. And I'm so glad that I did. And I'm so glad with the decisions that I made. And I'm very much looking forward to the articles that I'll be able to write with material that just didn't make it into the book.
Thank you. So there's a follow-on question here. I have to say that the questioner says that it's so interesting for me to hear that those images inspire violence. And I should stress that I wasn't suggesting they inspire me to violence. They evoke for me images of violence. But carrying on with the question, when I look at the butter picture, I see the sharpness of the knife disappearing in the softness of the butter, being swallowed by the softness and warmth of the butter. I guess what I want to ask is, how do you deal with intuitions very different from yours about the meaning of a work of art? It's a great question.
It is a great question. And I'm very happy actually to respond to it because, and this is one of the things I reinforce to my students always, there is no one inherent meaning in a work of art. We all come to them with our own perspectives, our own bodies of knowledge. It's not a free-for-all. I will, be very clear about that. Works of art, are not, endlessly, it's not about just saying, oh, this means this looks like this. But I do believe that these works, any work of art, has the capacity to hold so much potential. What I offer is and I make that very clear. And I even say at one point that, some of my interpretations will be shocking to some. And what I offer is just one of many possibilities. But it is an informed perspective. It is informed by very deep research and a body of knowledge, even as it's informed by me as a human being and who I am and what I see. So it's such a great question. And I think we all should look at works of art and enjoy them and do what we want with them. Of course, whatever gives you pleasure. But, for me, my goal, was, of course, a scholarly goal. And that was to try to construct a kind of context for thinking about these works. And yes, that butter, it is sumptuous, it is luscious, it is pillowy, it is gorgeous, it is all those things, but it's also other things. I hope, I convince my reader of that.
Right. Thank you. So that leads beautifully into this next question. Thank you for this wonderful work of scholarship and for sharing your personal insights. In your research of this period, did you come across many paintings of food that elicited opposite emotions, like joy, comfort? I'm interested, says the questioner, in the dichotomy between positive and negative imagery around food, and your choice to focus on the less romanticized versions of food as a reflection of society at that time.
Again, also a really good question. I'm not sure that I could, at this point in my life, in my career, really look at a work of an image of food and not see something more complex and nuanced than pure joy or comfort. Part of that is because of the writing of this book. Part of that is who I am as a human being. For me, food is really connected to my past, to my family, members of which are here, and it gives me such joy, to know that they're here. These are the people, and my friends, these are the people, with whom I have shared so much, and often that happens around food. Food ties us to our past, and so for me, I doubt that I would be able to see a kind of unequivocal comfort or joy or simplicity in an image of food. I just don't think I could. I mean, I may be wrong, and I will be the first one to admit it if it happens, but I really do believe, like any work of art, these images, these representations are deeply complex. And yes, situating them within this particular historical moment also helps me to elicit what is so discomfortable and so complex and unnerving about them. So yes, this is also very much rooted in a moment when food adulteration, food and drink adulteration was such a widespread problem. I mean, I get into that in the second chapter, and it's really astonishing. Here we are living in 2021. We need to be so grateful for all of the ways in which our food is protected. As I was speaking, I was very aware. I broke at one point to say, I'm sorry if you're eating dinner, but I was also very aware of, the vegetarians and the vegans in the audience, and the that it might be kind of upsetting to hear me talk about meat and animal slaughter. It's upsetting to me, but that's actually what's so remarkable about the work, the painting, and the photograph, that deeply upsetting connection to the animal and to contemporary practices that were themselves truly dark and troubling.
Yeah. So another question here. Thank you for your eloquent and enthralling talk. How did you make or discover the provocative connections between these compositions and contemporary social and historical events, such as between the dead fish and the morgue? And what were your strategies and resources for researching these contexts?
Thank you. Another great question. And that's a question about research, how we do our research. A lot of it was done in archives in Paris, and a lot of it was done using the incredible resources that we now have at our fingertips, because so many 19th century documents have been scanned and are available to us. When I think about the work for my first book, I very fortunately had a fellowship that allowed me to be in Paris for a year just to do research. And then I was able to go every summer. And I just had to gather and gather and gather. And it was only when I got back to New Haven that I could actually put this stuff together, because we didn't have any of that. That wasn't possible. And our research has changed so significantly. I think of my students and really, how they have so much at their fingertips. So my research, I do believe in, getting into the archives, looking at the works themselves as well. I was very fortunate. The museums in which these works live were all very generous with their files. And so they shared those with me as well. But, in Paris, various archives, the Bibliothèque Historique de la Vie de Paris is an incredible one. The Bibliothèque de l'École de Médecine was also an important one for me, and the Bibliothèque Nationale as well. But there are so many things that I, went to Paris to look at and look for that I now can just call up and search for and find in the Hathi Trust, which is probably one of the most remarkable databases.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope everybody is aware of it. It is truly amazing. But, I will also say part of that question is about an aspect of research that is truly full of joy for all of us. And that is what you find that you don't know you're looking for. I remember when I was working on my Veil book, just going through, sitting in the Bibliothèque Nationale, freezing, it was freezing. I remember that winter was so cold, and that just turning the pages of countless fashion periodicals that they actually let me turn the pages of, which is itself kind of shocking. Looking for veils. That was what I was looking for, trying to figure it out. And with this book, as I sort of launched the research for each of these chapters, each of which went in a very different direction, I have to say, I was just astonished by what I came across and how one thing led to another. And yeah, when I realized that the morgue, the new Paris morgue, opened in 1864, even though we don't have any evidence to say with assurance that Manet himself visited it, I have no doubt in my mind that he did. He loves stuff like that. And his friend Émile Zola certainly visited it. And we know that because of a wonderful scene in one of his novels in which he conjures visiting a corpse in the morgue. But, this was the morgue, even if he didn't go, though I think he really did. The morgue was, written about constantly in the periodical press. Images of it circulated widely. He knew about it. And so I really do believe that there's something about that kind of death, that is, and also, decomposing bodies, because one of the things that I also argue and discovered in my research on fish, in fish markets and the selling of fish in the late 19th century, is that in all of these manuals, you see that the tail, should be just perfect. But this one is frayed, which suggests that it's old and it's deteriorating. Mm-hmm. And so there's this sense of putrefaction and the kind of technology. This is another amazing fact that also brought things together for me. Another fact that I discovered, the technology that was used at the morgue, the marble slabs and water trickling onto the corpses to try to stem the deterioration, at least temporarily, or to slow, I should say, the deterioration. That was the very same technology that was used in the fish stalls at Les Halles to keep fish as fresh as could be. Marble and cold water. It is, to me, just incontrovertible that there is a connection. And it's these happenstance discoveries that lead to the next one. And I wish I could say there was a roadmap, but there isn't. And it's truly one of the joys of what it is that we do, that discovery, that sense of discovery, and what we don't even know is out there. And so when I say, and I said it a few times in my words, and I say it in the book, I had no idea the directions I would be going in. I really mean it. I really had no idea.
Thank you. So I've been saving up the very first question that was entered into the box because I like it so much. So Marni, obviously doing such rich scholastic work must have worked up quite an appetite. I'm curious, says the questioner, about your own kitchen, where I know you like to spend time as you worked on this book. Did you find that your research drove you toward any particular dishes or flavors, or perhaps out of the kitchen altogether?
Yes. Well, it's hard to talk about cooking and my kitchen as it sort of was before the pandemic. To be really quite frank, I'm trying to think back, because cooking for all of us for many of us, has really taken on a kind of importance and significance that it may not have had. And that's actually the case for me. I've always loved to cook. And I've always loved to feed people, but I also love to be fed. And I am fortunate to have family members and friends who are wonderful, wonderful cooks, and I enjoy food so much. But I would say that I've thought a lot about cooking this past year, and how it has brought me a great deal of comfort, actually. And how something that I did not grow up with, butter. I think in the 70s, there was this belief, at least in Brooklyn, there was a sense that butter was very unhealthy and you needed to use margarine. And margarine was what I grew up with, as horrifying as that sounds. My mother also didn't use much salt. And that, was just a family thing, partly because my grandfather had heart disease, but this is what I grew up knowing. And so I didn't grow up with butter, actually. And it gives me such pleasure to use it as an adult, and to use salt. I use salt so much because I understand the value of it. But it's so interesting how these things that I did not grow up with bring me so much pleasure now. I see Paul's comment about margarine being so vile. It is so vile. And one of the things I learned, some of you may know this, is that it actually was invented in the 19th century. It was created as a result of a competition to create a substance that could be used by the troops, Napoleon's troops, on when they were out fighting, and that wouldn't spoil the way that butter did. So margarine was invented as this substance, but of course it quickly fell away in France, and for whatever reason, it remained a popular thing in Brooklyn, New York for many years. I can say that with utter assuredness.
Well, thank you. So you've been so generous of your time with us this evening, and I'd like to close with a question about what comes next. I mean, there's a fairly dramatic shift from your first major project to your second project you've been talking about this evening, and so. Do you have a sense yet, and there's no particular reason why you should, but do you have a sense of what might come next? You've talked a little bit about writing shorter pieces that draw on some of the material that you've gathered during this particular journey. But setting that aside for the moment, do you have a sense of the next journey?
I do and I don't, to be really frank. This year, for all of us, has been pretty intense. And there hasn't been a lot of psychic space. I mean, as many of us know, finishing a book, we're working on various levels and, copy edits, copy edits, page proofs within months of the actual appearance of the final product. Just balancing that and other obligations and teaching and just the many things that we've done in ways that have been so I think complex this year. I haven't really allowed myself to get as far as I might have in the process, and part of that is, in fact, because I actually am working on a different article that's entirely unrelated to this, and that's actually taken a lot of brain space and energy. It has to do with a pastel by Degas, and the sort of materiality of pastel that I'm also very interested in. I will say this: my future project will have something to do with and will focus on issues of materiality. I'm interested in eco-critical theories and the idea of the landscape. But beyond that, I'm interested in farming and images of farmlands. In fact, that actually does come from some of the research for the Kaibut chapter, in which I did do research on these farms that produce the fruits that made their way into Paris. And so there's something there. I don't quite know yet how that will emerge, but I have a lot of deadlines for unrelated things coming up. It's really kind of amazing how life goes on in all of this. And, we throw ourselves fully into them. And I just haven't had the time to really commit to the next project, though I'm very aware that I want to, because I think it's really important, even while I'm, working on these other projects and finishing the ones that I didn't get to finish. The chapter that I ended up not including happens to be on a marvelous painting of a jar of peaches by Monet. And I'm very excited about turning that into an article. I actually did a lot of research for it. So I have a lot of material and will continue to do that. So that's actually going to be the next project after I finish the pastel project. These things just carry us along, don't they?
They certainly do.
Yes, and I just finished copy edits on an article that has literally nothing to do with this, because of course we're always working on many things. An article on photographs of Bette Morisot after her husband died. That's going to appear within the next few weeks, as I understand it in the Yale French Studies, in the Journal of Yale French Studies. And that was totally unrelated. So, I'm not that worried, because I do have all these other projects. But yes, I definitely see that third project kind of coming together. And I can tell you this, it will have the personal in it, and it will be written in a way that is meaningful to me, because I can do that now. I know it's okay. And I'm going to continue to take risks and allow myself to inject the personal and write in ways that may be, I hope, a little poetic and maybe, meaningful. I can say that.
Well, that's very exciting to hear, because you combine, you insert the personal into what you're doing with such grace and imagination, and it's so fascinating for the reader. So it's good that we're going to get more of that from you. And what is certain is that the next project will be vivid and imaginative and original and fascinating. And I think we're all so grateful for the extraordinary work that you do. And so thank you so much for talking with us tonight. Thank you, everybody who joined us. We're really glad to have you here. We're looking forward to seeing you again next fall, hopefully in person. And meanwhile, thank you for being with us, and please join me in thanking Marni Kessler.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you. And thank you all for your wonderful questions and for being here and for your lovely comments. I hope I get to read them. I've seen a few out of the corner of my eye. But thank you so much, really. This means a lot to me.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.